There you go.
Okay. So we're talking about transforming your modern workplace using Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So just for those of you that may not be familiar with that name, Microsoft Endpoint Manager is the latest name that you might have known as either System Center Configuration Manager for on-premises or Intune for in the cloud. So we've combined the naming for both those products into a single product, Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So that encompasses both of those products because we feel that it's necessary to make sure that we're looking at a hybrid type of scenario rather than two independent islands of endpoint management in SCCM and Intune. So Microsoft Endpoint Manager is still the same thing as what you knew as Intune. So this is the last of the 7 modules that we've got for Q1. We'll see what happens in Q2. But basically what we're going to be talking about today is the fact that the needs of most organizations has changed over the last, probably several years, but it's been accelerated in the last several months. So this idea that it's okay to have fragmented management systems, some management systems for your iOS devices, some management systems for your Windows devices, and things like that, into a more integrated solution. The idea that most of your devices are within your corporate network is really being transplanted with the idea that most devices are, or most of your services may be provided in the cloud. We're certainly seeing this in a large number of industries and countries. The idea that there has been less regulation around how things like identities and devices and data security is handled to a much more regulated type of situation where there are national or industry rules and regulations that you have to comply with. It's becoming more and more necessary to automate many of the processes around the management of your devices, the management of your data, and then the concept of going from an insourced, where one of your customers might be managing all these things themselves, to the idea of allowing this to be done by a partner like yourselves, right? Managing their devices for them and having to have the appropriate permissions and the ability to do this at scale. One of the most evident signs of this shift in the way that people work in today's business environment is the number of devices that we see proliferating around any given organization. On an average, a typical office worker might have 3 or 4, maybe even 5 or 6 devices when you start thinking about PCs, their smartphones, if they've got a smart watch, anything in between. Right there's a number of devices that data could potentially be stored on, and along with that growth and the ability to access resources from any of these different devices, the number of apps that are used in a given day has dramatically risen. So rather than just using the standard Microsoft applications of email and Word and so forth, there's now a variety of applications that can be used, things like Workday and Slack and Salesforce and Box, among hundreds of others. And so you have to protect your data in those locations as well. For many employees and customers, this is good news because it lets them get their work done, regardless of where they might be located, because these are cloud services. But on the other hand, there is the risk that there are more advanced threats and a sense of you have to watch over the organization's security perimeter as it dissolves, right? So this idea of being able to secure all your data within this organization's security perimeter has kind of disappeared and a lot of the organizational data can be stored in different locations all around the world. One of the things that we have to think about is what you might consider a clash of objectives. So the employees' goals really very rarely relate to the IT goals. So the employees simply want to get their job done, right? They want to have the ability to communicate with their coworkers, communicate with vendors or partners or people outside their organization. They want to be able to collaborate. On the other hand, IT wants to make sure that the data that these guys are trying to collaborate or trying to share is protected, right? You want to make sure that they're not just sharing confidential information, or that if they're sharing information even appropriately, that it doesn't accidentally get forwarded on to someone who has no business seeing that information. Employees simply want easy access to everything. IT wants to make sure that they have the ability to control that access to some extent. Employees want to be able to work anywhere, and IT, while certainly wanting to facilitate that, wants to be able to have some ability to ensure that the data is protected regardless of the device or the location of the end user. So there's a lot of seemingly conflicting goals, or at least goals that seem to be causing friction within a corporate environment. But with Endpoint Manager, you'll see that there's the ability to kind of bridge these different groups. And so that's what the idea of flexible device management entails, is the ability to manage your devices, whether we're talking about iOS devices, Android devices, even Linux devices for certain workloads, and then your PCs, and then managing the applications on all those devices, making sure that you can protect your data across the spectrum. And so that is what Microsoft Endpoint Manager is designed to do. It's designed to bring this depth of management and agility of cloud services to and address the task of securing your modern workplace. So the question is, why do we consider our solution to be the best? Well, for one thing, it is the most complete solution. It allows you to manage your iOS devices, Android devices, Mac OS, Windows devices, and it's doing this using the power of the Microsoft Intelligent Cloud. So the knowledge that we are able to collect from the millions upon millions of devices that we manage worldwide, to understand what threats exist, what problems applications might be causing on certain devices or certain operating systems, and so on. We're able to take that knowledge and apply it to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager solution, so that you're able to more effectively manage your devices. We also have the ability of applying things like conditional access and different security controls on these corporate and personal devices. I'll show you some of those things in just a few minutes. And then it's very easy to get this up and running. Because it is a cloud service, you don't have to install a whole bunch of servers and a whole bunch of agents and things like that. It's a pretty easy setup to get these things working and become productive. There are a number of different tools within the application or within the Endpoint Manager tool set that are very beneficial for management of both the devices as well as applications. So you can enable zero-touch provisioning of devices. So Windows Autopilot allows you to order devices from a vendor, HP, Lenovo, Dell, Microsoft, and ship those directly to the end user, never having to go through IT, When they log in with their corporate email address and corporate password. And then from there, Windows Autopilot pushes down the applications that they have access to. It pushes down any policies that apply to them to make sure that they're compliant with security policies and so on. And the end user never has to even go see the IT department, but IT still has the ability to manage these devices very effectively. Apple Business Manager, Android Enterprise, you can pre-provision these types of devices and ship them directly to your end users, and they turn on their devices and they're immediately enrolled in Intune. So you don't even have to ask the end user to perform any steps. They just log in. Application lifecycle management. This is something that's enabled for not just standard productivity applications like Office 365 or Adobe Reader or whatever, but it can be line of business applications. So you can package up line of business applications, push those to your end user endpoints, and have control over them that way. You can also publish applications for iOS and Android devices as well. It is important to be able to secure these things. So as I'll show you in just a few minutes, the ability to apply conditional access policies to your devices and to ensure protection of your data. This is one of the really nice features of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. It allows you to evaluate, for example, whether a user, their identity is at risk, but it also allows you to identify whether the device itself is at risk and apply conditional access policies accordingly. And then lastly, but certainly not the least important, is maximizing user productivity. So we want to make sure that in spite of these controls and IT management capabilities, the user is still able to get their job done. Otherwise, they'll find different ways to do that, and that might be outside the visibility of IT. So one of the things that we're able to do is deliver native app experiences that work and feel natural on any platform. So with the M365 suite, using Word, using OneDrive, using PowerPoint feels very similar whether you're on a Windows device, an iOS device, or an Android device. It doesn't have a completely disconnected type of experience. Providing easy access to resources. So using things like the Intune company portal, you can grant access to corporate resources that are internal and control access to those things using things like a managed browser. And that will give you things like single sign-on for a single name URL. Just as an example, you could have a URL that is http:// right? Just something simple like that. And if you're using the Intune managed browser, it will be able to connect your users to that website, even though there is no such website on the public internet. That it's not specific enough, but we can direct you to your internal resources where that is a valid URL. All right, so let's get into a little bit more of the details of how this is actually enabled. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the ability to manage your Windows 10 and other mobile endpoints. So what does this mean for your IT department? So in most cases, the complexity that IT faces comes from having to establish some kind of a balance between what the user expects, their need for access and mobility, and at the same time, maintaining the corporate responsibility of enforcing corporate policies and maintaining a solid security perimeter. So this complexity is creating a strain on IT and how they manage each of their endpoints. So how do they scale to the added user devices with the finite resources that an organization might have? So uh, as I mentioned, each end user could have up to 5 or 6 devices um, that have access to corporate data. So how do you manage all those things effectively? One of the things that I mentioned is this idea of autopilot. So autopilot, as I alluded to, allows you to ship from the PC vendor, ship new devices directly to employees, and they're able to log in and get access to the corporate resources, the corporate applications that they need. On the back end, IT just has to configure the autopilot service. They have to register the devices that are coming from the PC vendor. So there's coordination between IT and the PC vendor where we find certain um, machine identifiers. We register those in autopilot, and then autopilot, when it recognizes that that device has come online, is able to push a profile down to that end user so that they're able to get access to the things that they need. So very, very a powerful tool, especially did it become necessary back in March and April. We had customers and partners that were buying hundreds and sometimes in some cases thousands of laptops to support remote workers. And autopilot was really the only way that they could get this done because end users were working from home. They weren't allowed to come into the office and get their image or their laptop imaged or acquire their new device. It just wasn't safe. So Windows Autopilot allowed the organization to ship the devices to the end user directly at their house, and they had a standard image deployed to them. Actually, it wasn't a standard image; it was a standard configuration, I should say. As I alluded to earlier, we have the ability to provision devices, whether they're iOS, Mac OS, or Android, and depending on what features you want to enable, um, you may use a product like Jamf to enable some of the more sophisticated management capabilities in Mac OS. But we do have things like the device enrollment program for Apple iOS, the Android Enterprise for Android. Um, if your customer is buying Samsung devices, you can provide very extensive security controls using the feature called Samsung Knox. It provides very strong security controls for Samsung devices specifically. So there's a lot of different things that can be done here with these different platforms that are not even running Windows, including pushing applications to them, making um, different internal resources available to them using different tool sets. But your end users that are running these third-party devices or non-Windows devices, I should say, still have the ability to work and have access to the corporate resources that they need. So speaking of applications, Intune now can, or not Intune, Microsoft Endpoint Manager can now leverage the capability of using MDM. So just as a kind of a brief refresher, there's a difference between MDM and MAM, mobile device management and mobile application management. In one case, you're managing the entire device. For example, making sure that data is encrypted on the device, making sure that the user can't use the camera, things that maybe are hardware related. That's mobile device management. Typically, that doesn't go over very well if the user is bringing their own device. They don't want to have IT preventing them from taking pictures of their kids. And so in that case, with BYOD, we would use the concept of mobile application management, where IT pushes an application to the user's device and has the ability to manage that application and the data that that application can connect to. But we don't control the the ability to use your camera or other things on the device that the end user wants to control. So with this ability to manage your applications in Endpoint Manager, you can deploy third-party applications, your own line of business applications, as well as applications that come from the Microsoft Store. You can deploy these to your end users on their Windows 10 devices directly from the cloud. Similarly, with your Google Play Store, you can again have a managed Play Store where you can specify these are the applications that are licensed by the organization that you're able to access, right? So we see here the ability to add an application to the Google Play Store or to the iOS Store. You're able to say these are the approved applications that you as an employee can access and get those pushed down to your device in a managed fashion. Similarly with iOS devices, so I mentioned the ability to deploy devices, and that's what's being displayed here is the idea of the device enrollment program, where Apple will tell you these are the devices that we're going to ship to you. We're going to ship you, 10 iPhones. These are the devices. Enroll them in Endpoint Manager, and then as soon as the user turns them on, they'll already be managed by Intune. So there's nothing required of the end user. So this typically comes into play in situations like education, where the devices don't belong to the kids that are using them, and you want to have very granular control over what children are allowed to do, what websites they're allowed to go to, what applications they can install, and things like that. It's not typically seen a whole lot in corporate environments because in most corporate environments, people are bringing their own device, so they're not being managed top to bottom by Intune or by Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So there are hundreds of different devices that can be managed with Intune. There are also thousands of services that can be enrolled in Azure Active Directory for single sign-on. So if you want to, for example, allow your Salesforce users to sign in with the same credentials and log in that they use to log in to their email, you can use single sign-on to accomplish that. Same thing with Box, with Concur, with a number of different applications support that capability. The reason that's valuable is that it allows you to have central control over what applications an end user can access, and you don't have to have a very complex lifecycle management capability in order to revoke access to applications that a user no longer should be accessing. So for example, if someone moves from the sales department into finance, maybe they don't need access to Salesforce anymore. You don't have to go into a separate management portal for Salesforce and remove their username and their access to data. It could just be removing them from a group in Azure Active Directory. So it simplifies the ability for IT to manage access to applications, but it also makes it easier for end users to know how to log into those applications. They don't have to manage dozens of username and password combinations for the different applications that they have in the corporate network. Okay, so what makes the endpoint manager workplace trusted? What makes it something that is secure and that has a limited amount of overhead for IT? Let's take a look. As I mentioned, there are these concepts of MDM and MAM. And it's nicely represented here with these little visuals. So with MDM, you are applying strict security controls over the entire device, right? So you're looking at hardware as well as software. With MAM, mobile application management, you're creating security controls on individual applications, whereas you let the end user manage their device as a whole, as well as their own personal applications, their Instagram, their Facebook, their whatever other tools that they want. The way we accomplish this is through the use of conditional access. So we're able to restrict what a user is able to do at a very baseline level, or what they're able to do with a certain application. So I'll show you briefly what that means in just a minute or two. We have this concept of application protection policies. So you can protect corporate data even if the device itself isn't managed. What this does is it enables the bring your own device scenario, or situations where users bring their own personal devices to work, because users might be reluctant to enroll their devices. There are a number of different device management platforms, for example, VMware Workspace ONE, that do a very good job of managing devices, but it requires that end users enroll their devices in the management platform. And that is sometimes not the most well-received news for users. They feel like, this is my device. I don't want IT seeing everything that I do, on my Facebook, on my Twitter, on my Instagram. That's none of their business. So with app protection policies, we can protect the applications themselves and leave the rest of the data alone. Make sure that it's not impacted in any way. But what's good is that also prevents things like, if I've got an email and it's got some juicy information, I'm not able to copy the data in that email into my Twitter and then tweeting that out to the whole world, right? We kind of create this fence between the applications. And if you try to move data from a managed app to an unmanaged app, we're not going to allow that. For scenarios just like that, right? We don't want people copying data that's sensitive into areas that are unmanaged by the organization. And that's kind of what's being described here. Is with Word, you may have two instances of Word. So for example, you might have Word that is associated with the corporate installation of Word, but as an individual end user, you may have an Outlook.com account where you also have access to Word, and yet we're still able to separate those corporate and personal data stores, and Word can still access both of them, but we understand where the data is coming from and can prevent switching data between the two, and making sure the data is protected that way. Similarly, as I described before, you may be able to open an email attachment. It allows you to click copy, but it doesn't allow you to actually paste into a personal application. So let's say you're on an iOS device, you might want to copy some information from Excel into I can't remember what it is that iOS calls their thing that looks like Excel sheets or something like that. But anyway, you can't copy it into that personal application. Similarly, you can't take that email attachment and save it to your personal OneDrive, but you can save it to your corporate OneDrive. So we have this concept of understanding what is personal, what is able to be managed by the organization, and we can prevent that data from being stored in locations where the organization doesn't have control over that data itself. And along with that, we can use conditional access to ensure that the device itself makes or meets certain requirements. So in other words, I want to make sure that if this is an Android device, I want to make sure that this device hasn't been jailbroken before I'll allow you to access your corporate email. I want to make sure that nobody else is surreptitiously trying to access your email account by having jailbroken your device. We can also detect things like malicious apps or if the device has been manipulated, if there are network exploits at play. We can identify all those things using conditional access, and depending on whether the device passes or fails, you can block access to the applications and, for example, wipe the device, or you can allow access to the applications and the user can continue on their way. There are also areas of integration for endpoint security for iOS and Android devices. So there is a Defender ATP client for Android devices. For iOS and Mac devices, or rather for iOS devices, there is not a Defender integration, but there are tools like Zimperium and Lookout that can be installed that can feed information to Defender so that you have a comprehensive view of threats to your iOS devices. What's being shown here is the concept of security baselines. So you can define what a secure iOS device or what a secure Windows device should look like in your organization and track to see which devices are compliant with that baseline, and then use that baseline as a way of granting access to corporate data. So you can say, if the device does not match the baseline, if it falls into this orange area, then I'm not going to allow them to access SharePoint until they bring their device into compliance. And it might be something as simple as just getting the latest update from the Apple Store or something like that. But you can make sure that the devices that are connecting to your corporate assets meet a certain security baseline level. And so that's really what is being described here. So if you're using Microsoft Edge on your iOS devices or on your Android device, on your Windows devices, we have this idea of a managed browser. And the managed browser will allow users to connect to internal corporate resources without using things like a VPN or some kind of a proxy, things like that, where the user has to configure something unusual on their device they may not understand. By using the managed browser, it gives them access directly into the back-end corporate resources that you define and allows them to access those from their devices. So let's skip out of the slides for a minute and we'll talk about a few of these things before we move on. All right, so one of the things that I've been mentioning is this idea of endpoint manager. So it used to be called Intune. So if you would go into your admin center, you used to see a selection here called Intune. Now it's called Endpoint Manager. Same thing, or same capabilities anyway. So in the Endpoint Manager, if I go to devices, this is my test lab. So I've got an Android device, I've got an iOS device, and I've got a Windows device. They're all being managed by, or they've all been enrolled into Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I can see if there's any enrollment alerts, nothing there. Compliance status, all my devices are compliant with my policies. The configuration, so I've only got one user that's connecting to all those devices, and then any software deployments that I wanted to push to those devices would show here. Now, I talked about the idea of enrolling devices. So this is how you can enroll your devices using Windows. So if you wanted to use Windows Autopilot, this is one way that you can configure that using the deployment profiles and defining which devices you're going to allow Autopilot to provision. But if you use Apple, you're going to have a connection to the device enrollment program. This is very easy to set up. You create a certificate that allows Apple to communicate with Intune so that we understand which devices Apple is provisioning to the organization, and we can configure them appropriately. Similarly with Android, you've got the Manage Google Play Store. So again, you know which devices Google is going to be sure, whatever Android supplier is going to be providing to your end users, and you can manage the applications that are allowed on those devices. You can create an internal Play Store so that you can push applications that people within your organization would have access to, and they're able to download those. Applications. So we can provision applications for different platforms. So as we see here, I've got Microsoft 365 applications configured for Windows 10. If I go in here to the configuration, I have the ability to define, for example, which applications I'm making available to my end users. So if I don't want to allow Publisher or Skype for Business, I can do that. What is the update channel? So how soon are the applications updated to the latest builds? Right, so I can configure those things. I have the same capabilities for each of the other applications, so I can push these types of apps or make these types of apps available on iOS devices. It gives me the same sort of capabilities. I can assign who gets these applications or who's allowed to access these applications. So in this case, I'm saying the sales and marketing group is the group that's allowed to have this application installed for them. And then we talked very briefly about application protection policies. So if I go here to the iOS app protection policy and look at it's building very slowly. We go to the properties. I can see, for example, going to the data protection side, that I am not allowing organizational data to be backed up to iCloud, right? So iCloud, if this is my personal device, iCloud is managed by me, right? Now, if I'm backing up corporate data to my instance of iCloud, and then I leave the company, I still have access to all that corporate data. So I can block those types of things from being allowed. What am I allowed to send to other applications? Only the applications that are being managed through this policy can trade data between themselves. So I might be able to copy data from an Excel spreadsheet into a Word doc, but not necessarily be able to copy that same information from Excel into notes in your iOS device. So we provide a lot of different capabilities here. Third-party keyboards, in this case, it says allow, but that probably is not a good thing. There are a lot of third-party keyboards that will effectively serve as keyboard loggers. So they'll capture data that's being typed into a keyboard and send it back to maybe a threat actor of some sort. So you may want to turn that off. So we don't have time, obviously, to go through all the settings here. That's not really the point, but to give you a sense of what's available here. Endpoint security, we lightly touched on this idea of being able to create security baselines. So with a security baseline, I can say for my Windows 10 devices, these are the settings that I want to configure. Right, so I'll say next. And then these are all the policies effectively that I want to apply to the Windows 10 devices on my network. So this is very similar to group policy that you saw in Active Directory on-prem. Things like being able to control what people are allowed to do in Internet Explorer. It's a little bit slow loading, but there's probably a lot of settings. So being able to control what people can do in Internet Explorer, how you configure Windows Firewall, all these things can be done again through the cloud. So we've got a few minutes left. Let's zip through the slides, and then we'll come back to some more demo stuff. Okay. So again, the ability to allow users to enroll their devices, to get app updates, while still applying the necessary configuration and compliance policies to the end users. Sorry about that. That's one of the things the Endpoint Manager allows you to accomplish. I've referred from time to time to the company portal. So this is what the company portal looks like. It's kind of your own corporate app store where you can publish applications that your end users would need access to. It can even be books. There's ebooks that you want end users to have access to. You can publish them in your company application store, your company portal app. But also applications. So for example, here's one for help desk, or maybe a news feed, whatever it might be. So it allows you to create this separate app store that end users can access. What is very nice about this is that this allows users to enroll or unenroll their devices at their own discretion. So all they have to do is download the company portal app, log in with their normal email address and password, and they automatically get access to all those things that I showed in the previous slide. So they have the ability to access those applications, but it also, if you set it up, allows them to reset their own passwords, which is a fantastic capability since password resets tend to be the biggest help desk requirement for most organizations. That's where most of the help desk tickets are generated, is password reset. So if you allow users to do this through the company portal on their mobile devices, you can offload a lot of work from your help desk. One of the things that's important to remember is that Microsoft Endpoint Manager is not limited to just your mobile devices and Windows 10 devices. It also means that you can manage things like digital signage, public kiosks, and phone room devices. So if you have devices that are being used for teams, so maybe you've got a Surface Hub, or you've got some signs in the store that, digital signage, you're able to manage them using Microsoft Endpoint Manager as well. And it doesn't have to be logged in with a particular user account. And there's a reduced cost associated with that as a result. And as I showed you, the Endpoint Manager, the Endpoint Manager Admin Center, is accessed directly from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It has the same look and feel, very, very familiar to those of you that are working in M365 already. From a licensing perspective, the good thing about this is that most of the features that I showed you here are going to be available in just about all the SKUs. So obviously the M365 E5 SKU or E3 SKU is going to have many of these things, but some of the things for like device management and conditional access are available in the F SKUs for the first line workers. The M365 business SKUs now has many of the same capabilities that are in the enterprise SKUs, which is a great, great thing for the SMB market. And then education. This is from, I believe, 2019. So as of July 2019, Microsoft is considered one of the leaders and one of the visionaries. So ability to execute and completeness of vision. Only VMware and IBM seem to be kind of neck and neck with Microsoft on the endpoint management side. There is a new Gartner study that is supposed to be out either last week or this week. I can't remember what, but it's right around the same time that it was last year. So we're looking forward to seeing where Microsoft got positioned in their Magic Quadrant this year. Lots of compliance regulations that we're in line with. So I didn't see specifically POPI listed here for South Africa, but many of the same controls that are required by POPI are required by things like GDPR and some other regulations. So you can come to something similar to POPI by applying some of these other regulations as well. Okay, I'll pop back over to the demo, and I'll show you just a couple more things before we leave. So I didn't get a chance to talk really about Azure Information Protection, but Azure Information Protection is very, very important when it comes to securing the data within your organization. So Azure Information Protection, there's a couple different ways it can be used. So number one, you can simply label data, right? Which is called marking. So I can apply a mark to a type of data, but it isn't necessarily protecting that data. So in other words, I'm saying when somebody applies this label to a document, in this case, let's say, here we go. So they're going to have this watermark. It's going to say confidential financial data. But the data is not being encrypted in any way. It's not being secured. Anybody can read it. It just has a label on it. And that might be useful as you start the process of going through implementing Azure Information Protection, because you don't want to start encrypting things and blocking people out without knowing what kind of data it is. So labeling is your first, your starting point. This is where you say, this is the types of data that I have. Then once you've determined that, then you can go in and start applying protection. So for example, here we do have protection applied. So because this information is confidential and we want to make sure it's secure, we can apply encryption to the data so that the protection follows the document no matter where it goes. So that's a very high level overview of how you can use Azure Information Protection. There's lots of stuff we could talk about as far as how you discover your data, what the process is for going through and labeling and so on, but obviously we don't have time to do that. One of the things that I mentioned back here in the endpoint manager was the idea of being able to apply conditional access policies to your application and devices and so on. So if we go in here to conditional access, it takes us actually over to the Azure Active Directory area where conditional access policies are defined. But let's say that I want to apply a conditional access policy to this blue app, okay, whatever blue app is. What I've done here is said, when this user, Adele, wants to connect to the blue app, right? When she wants to connect to this blue app, under these conditions, if her user account is deemed to be at medium or high risk, maybe because there's been an impossible travel scenario or some other type of situation, if those are true, then what I'm going to do is say she has to multi-factor authenticate, provide multi-factor authentication before she can access that data, and her device has to be marked as compliant. So you remember back here, we had compliance policies. Okay, so if I go to compliance policies, if Adele is connecting with an iOS device, she has to meet these compliance policies in order to access the blue app under certain conditions, right? So you can apply these policies in a very granular way to make sure that access to sensitive corporate information is controlled and regulated in a very granular way. The last thing I'll touch on here before we wrap up is endpoint security. So I talked about the security baselines, but you can also configure all these different settings for your Windows 10 devices. So I can define my antivirus settings, whether I'm encrypting devices. And it's not just encrypting, but it's also doing things like, let's see if we can find it here. Oops, that's not what I wanted. There we go. So I can define, for example, which drives on the device I'm going to apply BitLocker to, right? So is it just going to be the OS drive? Is it going to be any data drives? Is it going to be removable drives? Do all of them have to have BitLocker applied? So this allows you to secure data that is living on the endpoints, depending on, regardless of what kind of device they're using. Lastly, Microsoft Defender ATP. So if I've got Defender ATP in my organization, I can configure the policies for Defender ATP as well. There are a number of things that we did not have a chance to get into, things like compliance policies for things like what am I thinking of? So like if a person is trying to email data outside an organization that has financial information, like a credit card number or a bank number, or if they're sending information that's related to personally identifiable information, we can restrict those types of things from exiting the organization. But that would require probably another hour of discussion. There's some information here, third-party resources that you can look up about the Endpoint Manager tool set and how it's fared from a external organization standpoint, how like Gartner and IDC and Forrester have evaluated our endpoint management tools. And then there are some good resources here for how you can start implementing these in a very structured manner and a way that will benefit your organizations. That brings us to the end of this session and the end of this series. So I thank you for your time. I hope it's been useful for you. We'll see what Q2 brings. But I appreciate everyone attending. And again, I will post this this information in the same place that I have been for the last several weeks, and I'll send the link to Jennifer, and she can, or Jessica rather, and she can provide it to everybody that's on the call. So thanks for your time and attention, and we'll talk again soon.
Fantastic, David. Thank you so much. You were wonderful as always. And thank you to everyone for attending. We'll see you in Q2.